How does a man walk away from his own graveyard, knowing every step he takes is a betrayal of the sons he leaves behind to die? That question hung in the stale, recycled air of the Malinta tunnel, like the smell of gangrene and cordite. It was March 1942, and the rock of Corregidor Island, the last jagged tooth of American resistance in the Philippines, was shaking. Above us, the Japanese artillery was pounding the earth into a moonscape, a relentless rhythm that rattled the teeth in your skull. But down here, deep in the bowels of the fortress, the silence between the blasts was worse. It was the silence of a waiting tomb. General Douglas MacArthur sat at the edge of his cot, staring at the concrete floor. In the dim, flickering light of a single bulb, he didn't look like the Caesars of the Pacific. He looked like a 62-year-old man who had seen the end of the world. He held a telegram in his hand, the paper damp with the humidity that clung to everything in that hole. It was an order from President Roosevelt. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command. Proceed to Australia. Immediate extraction. He crumpled the paper in his fist. To leave meant survival. But to a man like MacArthur, survival felt like a dirty word. He looked up as his chief of staff, Richard Sutherland, stepped out of the shadows. Sutherland looked like a ghost, his uniform hanging off his skeletal frame, eyes hollowed out by months of half rations and zero sleep. Sutherland cleared his throat, the sound sharp in the heavy air. He told the general that the PT boats were ready. The moon was dark. If they were going to move, they had to move now. MacArthur stood up, and for a moment, the old fire returned to his eyes. He paced the small lateral tunnel, his voice low and jagged. He said they were turning him into a deserter. He said the boys on Bataan, the ones eating monkey meat and dying of malaria, were looking to him to save them. He said he would rather die here, with his boots on, than run away like a thief in the night. But Sutherland pressed him. He told him the hard truth, the American truth. He said that dead, MacArthur was just a martyr, a story for the history books. But alive? Alive, he was a symbol. He was the only hope those boys had of ever seeing home again. If the symbol falls, the war is lost. The general stopped pacing. He looked over at his wife, John, and his young son, Arthur. They were huddled in the corner, wearing oversized helmets, their faces pale and streaked with grime. He wasn't just a general then. He was a father and a husband, the burden of command warring with the instinct to protect. He nodded, a slow, painful movement. He would go, but not to retreat. He was going to sharpen the sword. The walk to the dock was a funeral procession. The air outside the tunnel was thick with smoke, the sky lit up by the distant fires of Manila across the bay. MacArthur stopped to shake the hand of General Jonathan Wainwright, the man he was leaving behind to hold the line. Wainwright was gaunt, leaning on a cane, a man who knew he was signing his own death warrant. MacArthur gripped his hand hard. He gave Wainwright a box of cigars and 2 jars of shaving cream, a pathetic parting gift for a man about to walk into hell. He told Wainwright to hold out. He told him he would be back with an army. Wainwright just smiled a sad, thin smile and promised to do his best. We loaded onto the PT-41 boat. It was nothing more than a plywood shell with torpedo tubes bobbing violently in the chop. As the engines roared to life, a deep, guttural growl that vibrated through the deck, MacArthur took one last look at Corregidor, the rock. It was burning. The Japanese were closing in, the noose tightening every hour. He pulled his cap down low, his face a mask of stone. He didn't wave goodbye. You don't wave goodbye to men you are sentencing to captivity. The breakout was a nightmare of salt spray and terror. The sea was rough, tossing the small boat like a toy in a bathtub. Waves crashed over the bow, soaking everyone to the bone. The general, the man who commanded armies, was down on his hands and knees, retching into a bucket, his body betraying him, even as his mind raced. We dodged Japanese destroyers in the darkness, running silent, holding our breath every time a searchlight swept the black water. It was a gauntlet of steel and ocean, a desperate gamble where the stakes were the morale of an entire nation. For 2 days and nights, we ran. We ran until the fuel was low and the nerves were frayed to the breaking point. When we finally transferred to a B-17 bomber for the last leg to Australia, the tension in the cabin was electric. We were leaving the war zone, but the war was coming with us. We landed at a dusty airfield in Batchelor, then took a train south to Adelaide. It was at a little stop called Terowie, where the weight of the journey finally settled. The station was nothing special, just a platform in the middle of the dry, hot Australian scrub. Flies buzzed in the heat. A small group of reporters had gathered, tipped off that the Eagle had landed. They looked at MacArthur, expecting a conquering hero. What they saw was a tired old man in a wrinkled uniform, his face gray with fatigue. But then, something happened. As the reporters raised their pencils and the flashbulbs popped, Douglas MacArthur straightened his spine. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his signature corncob pipe. He put it in his mouth, clenched his jaw, and the transformation was instant. The exhaustion vanished, replaced by an aura of absolute, unshakable command. He stepped toward the reporters. He didn't read from a script. He spoke from the gut, his voice raspy but clear, cutting through the noise of the steam engine hissing behind him. He spoke of the siege, of the bravery of the men he left behind, and then he delivered the line that would become his prayer, his promise, and his curse. He looked directly into the camera, his eyes boring a hole through the lens, addressing not just the press, but every mother in America and every Japanese soldier in the Pacific. He said, "I came through, and I shall return." He didn't say we, he said I. It was the height of arrogance, and yet it was exactly what the world needed to hear. In that dusty train station, thousands of miles from the front, the general declared his own personal war. He turned away from the cameras, the promise hanging in the hot air like a thunderclap. The escape was over. The crusade had just begun. How much is a man's word worth when the currency is blood and the bank is a burning beach halfway across the world? For 2 agonizing years, that was the question that ate at Douglas MacArthur's gut like battery acid. The year was 1944, and the Pacific War had turned into a grinder. In the air-conditioned strategy rooms of Pearl Harbor, the Navy brass, men with stars on their shoulders and slide rules in their pockets, were playing a different game. Admiral Nimitz and the boys from Washington looked at the map of the Pacific and saw geometry. They saw a straight line to Tokyo. They wanted to bypass the Philippines. They wanted to strike Formosa, cut the Japanese supply lines, and starve the empire into submission. It was cold, calculated, and efficient. It was the smart play. But MacArthur didn't give a damn about the smart play. He cared about the righteous one. To the Navy, the Philippines was just a cluster of islands, a logistical nightmare clogging up the shipping lanes. To MacArthur, It was a prison where 20 million people and thousands of American GIs were rotting in Japanese camps, waiting for a savior who had promised to return. He stood in front of President Roosevelt, his voice trembling not with fear, but with a holy indignation. He told the president that to bypass the Philippines would be to admit to the world that American honor was dead. He said that if we left those people to wither on the vine, we might win the war, but we would lose our soul. He stared the president down until the politics melted away, leaving only the hard, cold fact of moral obligation. MacArthur got his green light. The return wasn't a march. It was an eruption. October 1944. The invasion fleet that gathered in the Leyte Gulf was the largest armada the world had ever seen. It was a horizon of gray steel, battleships and carriers thick enough to walk across the ocean on. MacArthur paced the deck of the cruiser Nashville, his eyes hidden behind those aviator sunglasses, watching the coastline emerge from the mist. The tropical heat was suffocating, wet and heavy. But the general was in full-dress uniform, his khakis starched stiff enough to stand up on their own. He was sweating, but he didn't wipe his brow. A monument doesn't sweat. The bombardment began. A thunderous overture of naval guns tearing up the palm trees and the pillboxes. The smell of cordite drifted out to sea, mixing with the salt spray. This was it. The moment he had lived for since the darkness of Corregidor. When the landing craft crunched onto the sand of Red Beach, the ramp dropped into the surf. The beachmaster had messed up. The water was too shallow for the boat to dock, but too deep to walk dry. A younger man might have waited for a jeep. A lesser man might have worried about wet socks. MacArthur didn't hesitate. He saw the cameras on the beach, the newsreel men crouching in the sand, dodging mortar fire to get the shot. He knew the world was watching. He stepped off the ramp and into the knee-deep water. It was an image that would be burned into the retina of the 20th century. The old soldier, wading through the surf, his jaw set like granite, his staff struggling to keep up behind him. He ignored the sniper fire cracking overhead. He ignored the chaos of men shouting and engines roaring. He walked with a strange, deliberate cadence, as if he were walking into a cathedral, not a combat zone. His trousers were soaked, ruining the perfect crease, but it didn't matter. The water washed away the shame of 1942. Every step was a redemption. He reached the dry sand and didn't stop to take cover. He walked straight to a portable radio transmitter set up in a grove of shattered palm trees. The air was thick with smoke and the metallic taste of adrenaline. He grabbed the microphone, his hand shaking slightly. Was it Parkinson's? Was it the overwhelming emotion of the moment? No one knew, and no one cared. He spoke, and his voice cracked through the static, broadcasting to a waiting nation. He didn't speak in codes or military jargon. He spoke like a biblical prophet. People of the Philippines, I have returned. By the grace of Almighty God, our forces stand again on Philippine soil. Men who had been fighting in the jungle for 2 years, skeletons living on roots and hatred, heard that voice and wept. It was the vindication of a strategy that defied the logic of war, but embraced the logic of the human heart. MacArthur had dragged the entire American war machine back to this beach by the sheer force of his will. Standing there, with his wet boots and his corncob pipe, he wasn't just a general anymore. He was the master of the theater, the director of his own destiny. The Japanese thought they were fighting an army, but they were fighting a legend, and legends are a hell of a lot harder to kill. He had kept the promise. Now, he just had to finish the war. What happens when a man who has spent a lifetime mastering the art of destruction is suddenly handed the keys to creation? On September 2nd, 1945, the world found out. The stage was the teak deck of the battleship USS Missouri, anchored in the calm waters of Tokyo Bay. The sky was overcast, a dull sheet of gray hanging over the black ships of the greatest armada ever assembled. On the deck, it was a sea of white. Thousands of American sailors stood shoulder to shoulder, a silent wall of judgment. Douglas MacArthur walked out to meet the enemy. He wasn't wearing medals. He wasn't wearing a sword. He wore that same crushed service cap and a plain khaki uniform that looked like he'd slept in it. He didn't need the trappings of power because he was the power. The Japanese delegation arrived in top hats and tails, looking like undertakers at their own funeral. They were stiff, terrified, expecting humiliation, expecting the executioner's blade. They had been taught that the Americans were barbarians who would enslave them. But MacArthur flipped the script. He stepped up to the microphone, and he didn't bark. He didn't gloat. He spoke with the solemnity of a priest at a high mass. He said, "The issues involving divergent ideals and ideologies have been determined on the battlefields of the world, and hence are not for our discussion or debate." He wasn't there to punish. He was there to close the book. He signed the surrender documents with 6 different pens, handing them out like sacred relics to the generals who had fought beside him. When he declared, "These proceedings are closed," the clouds literally parted, and the sun hit the deck of the Missouri. You couldn't script that kind of drama. It was the final curtain call of the war, and the opening act of something entirely new. MacArthur moved his headquarters to the Daiichi building in Tokyo. It was an insurance building, one of the few structures left standing in a city that had been firebombed into charcoal. From his office window on the 6th floor, he looked down at the ruins of an empire. The streets were filled with starving people, men in rags scavenging for cigarette butts, women clutching hungry children. This was his new command. He wasn't just a general anymore. He was the supreme commander for the Allied powers. He was the SCAP. To the Japanese, he was the new shogun, a blue-eyed giant who had descended from the sky to rule over the ashes. Washington wanted revenge. They wanted to put the emperor on trial, hang him, and dismantle the Japanese culture brick by brick. MacArthur said no. He understood something the politicians didn't. He knew that if he killed the emperor, he would create 1,000,000 martyrs and a guerrilla war that would last for a century. He decided to do the impossible. He decided to use the emperor to save the democracy. The meeting happened at the American embassy. It was a moment that stopped the heart of a nation. Emperor Hirohito, the man considered a living god by millions, the man for whom kamikaze pilots crashed their planes into ships, came to see MacArthur. The photo taken that day was a shockwave. There was MacArthur, towering, relaxed, hands on his hips, collar open, looking like a casual grandfather. And next to him, tiny and stiff in a formal cutaway coat, was the emperor. In one click of the shutter, the myth of divinity was shattered. MacArthur didn't have to say a word. The image said it all. The god is just a man, and the man beside him is the boss. But then came the twist. MacArthur didn't crush them. He fed them. When the famine hit, He bullied the U.S. Congress into sending ships full of wheat and corn. He told Washington, "Give me bread or give me bullets." He saved millions from starvation. And then he remade their soul. He sat in that office and drafted a new constitution for Japan. It was a liberal dream, more progressive than the one back home in America. He gave land to the farmers who had been serfs for generations. He dismantled the war machine. And in his boldest stroke, he gave the vote to Japanese women. His own staff told him it was crazy that the Japanese men wouldn't stand for it. MacArthur didn't care. He forced it through. He believed that if you gave people dignity, they wouldn't want war. For 5 years, he was the absolute ruler of 80 million people. He was an American Caesar, ruling by decree, yet loved by the conquered. Crowds lined the streets just to see his limousine pass by. They didn't see a conqueror. They saw a protector. It was his masterpiece. The battles in the jungle were just tactics. This was civilization building. He had taken a feudal, militaristic empire and turned it into a modern democracy without firing a single shot. It was the greatest victory of his life, a triumph of ego and empathy woven together. But absolute power is a dangerous drug, and up in that high tower in Tokyo, surrounded by yes-men and adoring crowds, the old soldier began to believe that he could do no wrong. He began to believe that he was bigger than the president, bigger than the Constitution, and bigger than fate itself. And that is when the ice starts to crack. At what precise moment does confidence curdle into madness? That is the question that haunts the legacy of Douglas MacArthur. It wasn't on the beaches of the Philippines, and it wasn't in the ashes of Tokyo. It happened in the frozen hell of the Korean peninsula, where the line between genius and illusion blurred until it vanished completely. It was the summer of 1950, and the world was falling apart. The North Korean army had poured across the 38th parallel like a red tide, smashing through the South Korean defenses and pinning the American forces into a tiny, desperate corner known as the Pusan Perimeter. We were getting kicked in the teeth. We were bleeding out. Washington was in a panic, talking about evacuation, about a Dunkirk in the Pacific. But in Tokyo, the old soldier was calm. He was looking at a map, smoking his pipe, and plotting a move that was so audacious, so reckless, that his own Joint Chiefs of Staff thought he had lost his mind. He pointed a bony finger at a place called Incheon. It was a port city on the west coast, miles behind enemy lines. It was a nightmare of geography. The tides there rose and fell 30 feet. The mudflats were treacherous, and the seawalls were formidable. The Navy told him it was impossible. The Marines told him it was suicide. But MacArthur just smiled that enigmatic smile. He said the very fact that it was impossible was exactly why the enemy would never expect it. He wasn't playing chess. He was playing poker, and he was shoving all his chips into the center of the table. On September 15th, he rolled the dice. The invasion of Incheon was a masterpiece. It was the last great amphibious assault in history. The Marines hit the seawalls, climbed over the top, and cut the North Korean supply lines in half. It was a stroke of brilliance that only comes once in a generation. MacArthur watched from the bridge of the flagship Mount McKinley, wearing his leather bomber jacket, watching the enemy army disintegrate. He had done it again. He had pulled a rabbit out of the hat when everyone said the hat was empty. And that was the problem. Success is a dangerous liquor, and by the autumn of 1950, Douglas MacArthur was drunk on it. He believed he was infallible. He believed he could see things that mortal men could not. He pushed the army north, crossing the 38th parallel, driving toward the Yalu River, the border with China. He wanted to finish the job. He wanted to unite Korea. He wanted to crush communism in Asia once and for all. But Washington was nervous. President Harry Truman, a haberdasher from Missouri with a sharp temper, flew out to Wake Island in the middle of the Pacific to look the general in the eye. It was a clash of two worlds, the plain-spoken politician versus the American Caesar. The tension on that tarmac was thick enough to choke on. MacArthur didn't salute the president with the crisp snap of a subordinate. He shook his hand like an equal. He looked at Truman with a thinly veiled condescension. When they sat down in that hot, stifling Quonset hut, Truman asked the million-dollar question. He asked, "General, what are the chances of Chinese intervention?" MacArthur didn't blink. He took the pipe out of his mouth and tapped it on the ashtray. He said, "Very little. If they try to cross the river, I will turn it into the greatest slaughter in the history of warfare." He told the president that the boys would be home by Christmas. It was a promise made of hubris. It was a promise made by a man who had started to believe his own press clippings. He thought the Chinese were a rabble. He thought they wouldn't dare challenge the might of the United States and the brilliance of Douglas MacArthur. He was wrong, dead wrong. November came, and with it, the Siberian wind. The temperature in the mountains of North Korea dropped to 20, then 30 degrees below zero. It was a cold so profound it froze the oil in the guns and turned human flesh black. The American troops were strung out, overextended, marching through narrow mountain passes, thinking the war was over. They were eating Thanksgiving dinner on the hood of their jeeps, dreaming of home. Then the mountains came alive. It didn't start with artillery. It started with the sound of bugles and whistles echoing off the canyon walls in the dark. It was a sound that would haunt the nightmares of every Marine who survived the Chosin Reservoir. The Chinese didn't just intervene, they flooded the battlefield. 300,000 soldiers, moving like ghosts in white camouflage, poured over the border. They didn't have tanks or air support. They had canvas shoes and bolt-action rifles, but they had numbers, and they had no fear of death. They hit the Americans like an avalanche. The home by Christmas offensive turned into a fight for survival. The slaughter that MacArthur had predicted did happen, but it wasn't the Chinese who were getting slaughtered. It was his boys. The retreat from the Chosin Reservoir was a brutal, bloody slog through the snow, a fighting withdrawal that tested the limits of human endurance. Back in Tokyo, the news hit MacArthur like a physical blow. The impossible had happened. His intuition, the golden gut instinct that had never failed him, had led his army into a trap. But here is the tragedy of the man. He couldn't accept it. He couldn't look in the mirror and say, "I messed up." His ego was too big, too rigid. It couldn't bend, so it cracked. He didn't blame himself. He blamed Washington. He blamed the restrictions. He blamed the British. He blamed everyone but the man in the mirror. He began to send messages that sounded less like military assessments and more like the ravings of a man cornered. He demanded to bomb the bridges across the Yalu. He demanded to bring in nationalist Chinese troops from Taiwan. And then he went too far. He asked for the ultimate weapon. He wanted to use atomic bombs. He drafted a plan to drop dozens of nukes along the border, to create a belt of radioactive cobalt that would kill anything that tried to cross it for 60 years. He wanted to turn North Korea into a glass parking lot. He saw the conflict not as a limited police action, but as the final showdown between light and darkness. To the men in the foxholes, freezing and dying, MacArthur was still a god. But in the White House, the terrifying realization was setting in. The general wasn't fighting the Korean War anymore. He was trying to start World War III. He was openly defying the president, writing letters to Congress, leaking complaints to the press. He was challenging the very bedrock of American democracy, civilian control of the military. The gamble at Incheon had been a miracle. The gamble at the Yalu was a catastrophe. The old soldier had rolled the dice one time too many, and this time they came up snake eyes. He stood in his office in the Daiichi building, watching his masterpiece crumble, unable to stop the bleeding, unable to admit he was mortal. The clock was ticking. The end wasn't coming from a Chinese bullet. It was coming from a pen in Washington, D.C. The stage was set for the final fall. What is the sound of a god falling to earth? It wasn't a bang. It wasn't a cannon shot. It was the click of a teletype machine in a radio room on a Tuesday afternoon. April 11th, 1951. Douglas MacArthur sat at the lunch table in the American Embassy in Tokyo. He was the ruler of 80 million Japanese, the man who had defeated the Empire of the Sun, the man who believed he was the right hand of destiny. And then his wife, Zhong, tapped him on the shoulder. She had heard it on a commercial radio broadcast. There was no private courier, no respectful letter from the president. Just a news bulletin sandwiched between a soap advertisement and the weather report. President Truman had fired him. The Caesar of the Pacific had been handed a pink slip, like a factory worker caught sleeping on the job. The silence in that room was louder than the bombardment of Corregidor. MacArthur's face went white, then gray. For 52 years, the army had been his mother, his father, and his religion. Now, the temple had cast him out. He didn't scream. He didn't throw his plate. He simply turned to his wife and said, "Jeannie, we're going home." But as the plane carried him back across the ocean he had dominated, the tragedy of the man began to rot into something darker. The American people welcomed him back with a hysteria that bordered on madness. 7 million people lined the streets of New York City. The ticker tape fell like a blizzard, burying the avenues in shredded paper. They cheered him as a martyr. They cheered him as the victim of a small-minded politician. But the cheers were a lie. They were cheering for a ghost, for a myth printed on the front page of the tabloids. They weren't cheering for the reality. And the reality was a man whose arrogance had almost incinerated the world. Let's look at the ledger. Let's look at the blood on the white gloves. This was the man who, when his pride was wounded in the frozen mountains of Korea, demanded the authority to drop 30 atomic bombs. He didn't just want to win. He wanted to scorch the earth. He wanted to unleash a radioactive plague that would have poisoned Asia for a century. He was willing to gamble the existence of civilization to save his own reputation. The crowds in New York didn't see the frozen corpses of the Marines at the Chosin Reservoir, sent into a trap because their general refused to believe the Chinese were there. They didn't see the Korean villages leveled by napalm, the women and children burned alive in the name of a total victory that MacArthur fetishized like an idol. He stood before the joint session of Congress for his final performance. It was theater, pure and simple. He adjusted his voice. He paused for effect. He played the victim with the skill of a Shakespearean actor. He spoke of the old soldier who tried to do his duty. He painted a picture of moral clarity, but history is a ruthless judge. As he spoke those famous words, "Old soldiers never die, they just fade away," the veneer began to crack. Behind the medals and the rhetoric stood a man who had forgotten the first rule of the democracy he swore to protect, that the gun must always answer to the ballot box. He had become a warlord. He had come to believe that his judgment was superior to the Constitution. In his lust for glory, he had treated human lives, American, Korean, Chinese, as disposable chips in a game of global poker. The speech ended. The applause was deafening. But as he walked out of that chamber, stepping into the twilight of his life, the truth followed him like a shadow. He settled into a suite at the Waldorf Towers in New York, a king in exile. He spent his final years surrounded by memorabilia, rewriting his memoirs, polishing his own statue while the world moved on. The tragedy of Douglas MacArthur wasn't that he was fired. It was that he never understood why. He never understood that a true hero knows when to put the sword down. He never understood that the greatest victory isn't conquering the enemy, but conquering your own ego. He died in 1964, but the man had really died that day in 1951, when the music stopped and he realized he was just a mortal after all. He left behind a modernized Japan, yes, that is his monument. But he also left behind a warning, written in blood across the 38th parallel, a warning that when we elevate men to the status of gods, when we let the myth outshine the man, we court destruction. The old soldier faded away, but the scars he left on the world, those are still burning. The ticker tape is long gone, swept into the gutters of New York, but the question remains, was he a savior who flew too close to the sun, or a monster who nearly burned it down? The silence of the grave offers no answer. Only the wind, blowing through the graveyards of the Pacific, whispers the truth.